When the Second World War erupted, countless young men were pulled into a conflict far bigger than themselves. Armies marched across continents, cities burned, and supply lines strained under the relentless pressure of a global war. Yet, among the chaos, an unexpected comparison emerged, one that continues to surprise people even today. German prisoners of war, captured by American forces, often found themselves astonished by something simple but deeply human: the food they received inside American POW camps. Food that, in many cases, was noticeably better than what they had eaten as active soldiers in the Wehrmacht. But to truly understand why this happened, we need to go back in time, back to the foundation of the Geneva Convention, the American logistical advantage, and the realities of the German war machine as it struggled under the crushing weight of total war. Only then can we appreciate why German POWs sat at wooden tables in rural American camps, staring down bowls of hot stew or plates of bread, meat, and vegetables, wondering how prisoners could be treated better than frontline troops. The story begins with the nature of the United States itself. Unlike many nations dragged into the conflict from its earliest days, America entered World War II late, in December 1941. And when it did, it arrived with a level of industrial capacity unmatched by any other belligerent. American farms were producing on a scale the world had never seen before. Factories did not merely supply troops. They overflowed with food, canned goods, meat, vegetables, and processed rations designed for long-term storage. While many countries struggled to feed civilians and soldiers alike, the United States produced such an abundance that even its prisoners of war became unintentional beneficiaries. Contrast this with the German experience. Before the war even began, Germany faced agricultural limitations. Much of its farmland struggled to meet domestic needs, and the Wehrmacht relied heavily on supply lines stretched across conquered territories. As the Eastern Front consumed men and resources endlessly, Germany's ability to supply its own soldiers deteriorated sharply. Soldiers at the front often received thin soups, hard bread, potatoes when available, and occasional meat when supplies allowed. Many battalions lived day by day, scavenging or taking food from occupied areas just to stay operational. For German soldiers raised in a society accustomed to austerity, these shortages felt severe. But for those who would later become prisoners in American hands, the contrast became even more shocking. When Allied forces began capturing large numbers of German troops in North Africa, Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself, the question arose, what should be done with so many prisoners? The United States made a decision rooted in both practicality and principle. They would follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. That meant housing, clothing, medical care, and yes, adequate food. However, adequate in American terms far exceeded what most nations considered normal wartime rations. Inside camps across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, the Midwest, and the American South, German POWs found themselves eating meals built around American agricultural staples. Thick stews filled with beef and vegetables. Sliced bread that was soft compared to the dense German loaves they knew. Eggs, potatoes, rice, and seasonal fruits when available. Sometimes even desserts. Simple puddings or sweetened bread made their way onto the menu. And for men who had spent months fighting in the deserts of North Africa or freezing in the forests of Europe, these meals felt unreal. Many POWs later wrote in memoirs that the food seemed almost luxurious for prisoners. Some even admitted privately that they ate better than during their active military service. But the quality of camp food was not merely generosity. It was rooted in American strategy. Healthy prisoners meant fewer medical problems, less risk of unrest, and a system that aligned with American values. The U.S. government also understood the psychological impact. If German soldiers saw Americans treating prisoners fairly, their loyalty to the Nazi regime could potentially weaken. And there was another, more practical factor. Many POWs were used as laborers. They worked on American farms, harvested crops, repaired infrastructure, and provided essential manpower during a time when many American men were overseas fighting. Feeding them properly ensured productivity. Still, the surprise among German prisoners was genuine. These were soldiers conditioned to believe that enemies, especially Americans, would treat them harshly. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the U.S. as chaotic, decadent, and hostile. Instead, captured soldiers found order, stability, and meals that felt almost comforting. Inside camp fences, daily routines revolved around structured meal times. POWs lined up with metal trays, the smell of cooked food drifting from kitchen buildings staffed by the U.S. Army. Some camps even allowed German prisoners with culinary backgrounds to work as cooks, preparing meals based on American ingredients, but using German methods. This gave the food a familiar touch, making their captivity feel less threatening and more like an unexpected chapter of survival. However, the reactions of POWs varied. Some were grateful, quietly acknowledging their good fortune. Others were confused. How could the enemy treat them so well when their own government had sent them into battles with little more than rationed bread and thin soup? And for a small number, the experience created guilt. They knew civilians back home, including women and children, were struggling through food shortages and bombing. Yet here they were, in a foreign land, being fed regularly and generously. One former POW recalled writing in his diary that he felt ashamed to eat so well when he imagined his family surviving on meager rations in Germany. Another remembered the strange silence that fell during meals as soldiers contemplated this uncomfortable contrast. And so, while the physical nourishment mattered, the psychological impact may have been even stronger. For the first time, many captured Germans confronted the reality that much of what they had been taught about America was false. They saw discipline, order, and fairness within the camps. They saw guards who treated them as human beings, not as enemies deserving punishment. And through something as simple as food, they experienced a softer aspect of American strength. One powered not by force, but by abundance. But this was not the entire story. Even within the American system, the treatment of prisoners varied depending on location, supply conditions, and the attitudes of local commanders. And while the United States attempted to maintain Geneva standard rations, wartime shortages occasionally affected camp provisions. Nevertheless, the overall standard consistently remained far above what German soldiers had come to expect. By the mid-1940s, word began spreading among captured soldiers. Rumors circulated from prisoner to prisoner, carried across battlefields and frontline trenches. Men whispered that Amerika Lager might not be a place of hardship, but a place where a soldier could survive the war in relative comfort. This belief grew strong enough that, near the war's end, some German troops preferred surrendering to Americans rather than to British or Soviet forces, simply because the stories of American camp food seemed almost too good to be true. As the war approached its violent conclusion, German soldiers increasingly encountered the brutal reality of collapsing supply lines. Retreating units often left troops starving or scavenging for survival. In these final months, the contrast between life as a free but starving soldier and life as a well-fed prisoner became more striking than ever. And thus began a strange and ironic chapter in the history of World War II, one in which prisoners of war found themselves living in conditions, eating meals, and experiencing treatment that, in some cases, exceeded that of the army they once fought for. A chapter that revealed not only the industrial might of the United States, but also the fragile and desperate state of Germany as its war machine crumbled. This contrast, the difference between American POW camp food and Wehrmacht rations, did not just define the daily life of thousands of captured soldiers. It shaped their memories, their testimonies, and their understanding of a world far larger than the conflict they had been raised to fight. But the deeper story is only beginning. Because behind every meal served in an American POW camp is a chain of decisions, systems, and ideals that define what a nation stands for, even in war. And behind every ration served to a Wehrmacht soldier lies the story of a country stretched far beyond its limits, fighting a war it could no longer sustain. To understand the full picture, we must dive deeper into the origins of these policies, the first-hand experiences of POWs, the written accounts preserved across decades, and the voices of the soldiers themselves. Voices that reveal a surprising, human truth hidden inside the machinery of global conflict. As the war drew closer to its final, desperate months, the contrast between American POW camps and the collapsing German front became even more dramatic. By early 1945, Germany's supply chains were in ruins. Allied bombing raids crippled transportation networks, factories struggled to function, and the once feared Wehrmacht found itself unable to feed its own soldiers. Men who had once marched proudly under the German eagle now found themselves rationing thin slices of bread or waiting anxiously for supply trucks that rarely arrived. Hunger had become as dangerous an enemy as the Allied forces they faced. For many of these soldiers, captivity in America, something that once filled them with dread, began to seem like a strange sort of salvation. And when they finally arrived in the United States, transported across the Atlantic in guarded ships, the reality of their new lives felt almost surreal. These men, who had spent months or years living on the edge of starvation, stepped into camps where order, routine, and food awaited them. It was here that their understanding of the world began to shift in ways they could never have imagined. Meals were served at scheduled times, often accompanied by the warm scents of stews, freshly baked bread, and of vegetables simmering in large metal pots. For many POWs, the first days of captivity felt like stepping into a parallel world. They had lost the war, been captured by their enemies, and transported thousands of miles away from everything familiar. And yet they found themselves treated humanely, fed generously, and given shelter far safer than any frontline trench. But what truly surprised German POWs was not just the quality of the food, it was the attitude behind it. Guards did not sneer at them or mock their hunger. Cooks did not punish them for asking for more bread. Instead, the atmosphere felt controlled but strangely respectful. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also recognized as human beings, not merely defeated soldiers. Some POWs later wrote that their first full meal in an American camp felt like an emotional breaking point. One described sitting silently at a wooden table, staring at a bowl of thick vegetable soup, unable to believe that this was meant for him. Another recalled tears welling up as he cut into a slice of meat, something he had not tasted properly in months. These reactions were not dramatic exaggerations. They were the honest responses of men whose bodies had endured years of scarcity and fear. Food in this context became more than nourishment. It became a symbol of stability, a reminder that despite the horrors of war, compassion could still exist. Many POWs found themselves reassessing the propaganda they had grown up with. They had been told that Americans were decadent, selfish, chaotic, or cruel. Yet here they were, living in camps with structured routines, medical care, and meals that appeared almost generous in wartime conditions. This unexpected experience created a shift in morale and mindset. Some soldiers began questioning the decisions of their own leaders. How could a nation fighting on multiple continents still manage to feed its prisoners so well while Germany struggled to feed its own troops? The comparison was painful, but unavoidable. Inside the camps, life developed its own rhythm. Wake-up calls, roll calls, work assignments, recreational activities, and mealtimes formed a predictable daily structure. For soldiers who had been living under constant threat at the front, this predictability felt comforting. And as the weeks turned into months, the camp kitchens became a central part of daily life. The kitchens were not luxurious, but they were efficient. Using American ingredients, potatoes, canned vegetables, beef, rice, bread, beans, and seasonal produce, meals were prepared in bulk. Sometimes, German prisoners with cooking experience were assigned to the kitchens, giving them a sense of purpose and allowing them to add familiar touches to the dishes. A subtle blend of German cooking habits mixed with American ingredients created meals that tasted surprisingly close to home. Breakfast often included bread, margarine or butter, porridge, or eggs. Lunch was usually the largest meal, featuring stews or meat dishes, vegetables, and potatoes. Dinner was lighter, soups, bread, and sometimes fruit or desserts. For prisoners who had lived through the shortages of the Eastern Front or the devastation of bombed-out German cities, the abundance felt unbelievable. But despite this relative comfort, the emotional weight of captivity still hung heavy. POWs thought of families left behind, facing hunger, bombings, and uncertainty. Letters, when they arrived, often painted a grim picture. Civilians in Germany were suffering intensely as the war reached its final stages. Food was rationed strictly, cities lay in ruins, and winter only worsened the hardship. This created a deep internal conflict for many prisoners. Some felt guilty eating well in captivity while their families struggled. Others felt relieved simply to have survived, and some felt anger toward the Nazi leadership, blaming them for the needless suffering inflicted on both soldiers and civilians. The American camp kitchens, unintentionally, became a place where these emotions mixed: shame, relief, gratitude, and confusion. As the war ended in May 1945, the American camps remained active, holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Many feared that once the fighting stopped, their treatment would worsen. But instead, the food rations remained stable, and in some camps, they even improved. The United States understood that maintaining order in these camps required consistency, not sudden deprivation. It was during the post-war months that many POWs formed the most lasting impressions of the United States. With the fighting over, tensions eased. Restrictions loosened slightly. Work programs expanded, allowing prisoners to earn small wages or receive extra food for labor. And because many camps were located near rural American communities, POWs interacted indirectly with civilians. Farmers would watch them work in fields. Shop owners would see them march past during work details, and in many places, a quiet curiosity developed. Some American civilians were surprised to see that the German prisoners were not the monsters wartime propaganda had portrayed. They were simply young men, weary from war, trying to survive. And conversely, many German POWs were shocked to see the peaceful, organized, and prosperous nature of American towns. This peaceful environment contrasted sharply with the destruction haunting Europe. Food continued to play a central role in shaping these impressions. POWs working in agriculture often tasted fresh produce directly from American farms. Apples, corn, tomatoes, peaches, simple foods that felt extravagant after years of rationing in Germany. Farmers, despite being part of the enemy nation, sometimes offered small gifts: a piece of fruit, a cup of cold water, gestures that felt profoundly humane. By late 1945 and 1946, as Germany struggled through the early years of post-war collapse, many POWs found themselves healthier in captivity than they had been at any point during the war. This fact caused mixed emotions. Physical well-being clashed with emotional longing for home. Many feared returning to a destroyed country. Others eagerly awaited reunions with family. And some wondered whether life in America, despite being captivity, offered more stability than the chaos awaiting them in Germany. When repatriation finally began, the contrast between American camp life and post-war Germany hit many POWs with full force. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, entire neighborhoods had been flattened by bombing. Families survived on strict rations and humanitarian aid. Returning prisoners quickly realized that the meals they had received in captivity, meals they had once found surprising or even indulgent, had been far better than what most German civilians could access at home. This realization sparked a deeper reflection. Many former POWs later wrote that their time in American camps profoundly changed their worldview. They had entered the war believing in the strength and superiority of Germany. They left captivity with an understanding that much of what they had been taught was untrue. Seeing the industrial power and agricultural abundance of the United States firsthand forced them to rethink the ideological narratives they had grown up with. But beyond ideological shifts, there was a human lesson. For thousands of German POWs, food became the bridge between fear and understanding. Through meals served in large steel kitchens in dusty camps across America, they saw that even in war, compassion could exist, and that a nation's strength was not just measured by weapons or soldiers, but by its capacity to uphold principles even while holding its enemies behind barbed wire. Years later, many former POWs would tell their families about the surprising kindness they encountered in America. Stories of guards who treated them fairly, of meals that kept them healthy, of moments when humanity overshadowed hostility, and of the strange irony that they had eaten better as prisoners than they ever had as soldiers of the Wehrmacht. Some returned to America years after the war as immigrants, seeking to build new lives in a place that had once been the land of their captors. Others remained in Germany but carried the memories with them, a complex mix of gratitude, confusion, and introspection. But almost all agreed on one point. The food they received in American POW camps was a defining memory, one that highlighted a stark contrast between two nations fighting a brutal global conflict. This chapter of history, often overlooked, reveals a deeper truth about war and humanity. In the end, it was not just battles, victories, or defeats that shaped the memories of German POWs. It was something far simpler. A bowl of stew, a slice of bread, a moment of dignity offered in the midst of destruction. And so, the story of German POWs surprised by American camp food is not merely about meals or rations. It is about the power of compassion in times of conflict, about how a nation's values can reveal themselves even in the smallest acts, about how the human spirit survives through kindness, routine, and nourishment, and about how, sometimes, the greatest impact is made not by force, but by the simple act of feeding another human being. In the quiet dining halls of American POW camps, far from the battlefields of Europe, German soldiers experienced a side of America that no propaganda had prepared them for. They discovered that behind the might of the United States was a system built on order, abundance, and an unexpected measure of humanity. And in that unexpected kindness, they found the beginning of a new understanding, one that would stay with them long after the war had ended, long after the fences had been removed, and long after the world had begun rebuilding from the ashes.